Photograph leaders, welcome back to my channel. This is Pike Street in Kitty. That's Pike Street looking west, and we're at the intersection with Lamaha Street, which is the end of the eastern end of Kitty. Right, that's Kitty. But on the other side of this street, Lamaha Street, this is Campbellville. So this is Gordon Street in Campbellville. Those of you who have lived in this neck of the woods will probably recognize the boundary. But this is the Campbellville section of the city, east of Gordon Street, east of Lamaha Street. We just looked at Gordon Street in the previous video. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at Pike Street in Kitty. This is starting here in Pike Street, Campbellville. Kitty because we're going through the cross streets in Kitty from Public Road, which we've seen in the previous video, all the way down to Lamaha Street, which is the western boundary of Kitty, the southern boundary of Kitty, and we want to see what has changed. And this is what Kitty looks like in 2023. For those of you who've lived in Kitty before, this is Pike Street Kitty, would see the difference, see what it looks like in the 1960s and 1970s, when this was in fact one of the densely packed residential neighborhoods in the city. In other words, this is where the middle class lived in the city of Georgetown back in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, pre and post-colonial Guyana. But this was a very this was very sought after, a very prestigious neighborhood back in the 1960s and the 1970s. And this is how it has changed in 2023. So like I said, a lot of renovations now because of people returning from having lived in the US and Canada now look like this. That is in the 2020s, in the early 2010s they looked like that, like this. In other words, this is what renovations looked like in 2010 and beyond. Before those in the 1980s, 1990s, this is what renovation brought: houses that were concrete on the ground floors. This is a much more modern renovation, newer renovation, right? But that's renovation in the 1980s, converting wooden houses into concrete structures. So a lot of these concrete buildings are renovated in the 1980s, 1990s, right? They became concrete buildings being converted from wooden structures. But Pike Street was also one of the prestigious neighborhoods to live in back in the 1980s, 1970s, 1960s, because it was city, it's part of Georgetown. It was part of the capital city, and it was a residential neighborhood, exclusively residential neighborhood. This is a renovation, more recent renovation in 2000s, probably much more recent, like 5 years ago, because that's what they do now that you're in the 2000s. You can build houses that look a lot more like they do in North America. But this is what renovations look like here on Pike Street in the 1990s and 1980s. That's Pike Street in Georgetown. Now as you get towards Alexander Street, you get much more commercial properties. More commercial properties on the ground floor of these residential properties, because of course it was also that part of Kitty. This part of Kitty is also has its own business district. Or as you get to Alexander Street, where there's a market, the Kitty Market, and all of those shops, there is a demand for commerce, and that's what you get even here on Pike Street as you get close to the intersection with Alexander Street and Kitty. This is a new, what's a carpet house, a new renovation or expansion of a property, a residential property being converted into commercial property. But this is what was there before. This is the earlier renovations here on Pike Street, where the wooden buildings were converted into concrete structures. At this intersection, Pike Street and Alexander Street, we have Bounty. This is Bounty supermarket here in Kitty. It's a major grocery and supermarket chain. Bounty supermarket, I think they open at 8 o'clock. We're about 7 now. Right, this is Alexander Street and Pike Street. Alexander Street looking south towards the market. The market is in fact right, that building, almost at the end of the street. As we continue along Pike Street west, that is Bounty Supermarket. Looking back along Pike Street to the east, right, and that is a plant shop. This is cupcakes and pastries. So this is what's happening here on Pike Street in Georgetown, right? So a lot of these buildings are in the original form. For example, this is an original residence here on Pike Street from the 1960s perhaps, right? But this is what happened in the 1990s. A lot of the concretization of these buildings. Pike Street, it seems wider than Gordon Street. It's in fact a bit wider, the street is, than most of the streets in Georgetown. But this is one of the newer renovations in the 2000s. What happened is they started building them taller. Morning. You take advantage of space above in order to get more volume into the buildings. You need to go up higher, but you can tell which buildings were renovated in which decade based on the architecture and the material with which the renovation is made here on Pike Street. This, for example, is a new renovation that's currently being built in an old lot, and here is an older renovation here on Pike Street. As you approach St. Road, coming to the end of Pike Street in Kitty. If you've lived in this neighborhood, you probably recognize some of these buildings because a lot of the neighborhood has not changed. The form of the neighborhood has not changed, even though some of the exterior of the buildings have changed. You probably recognize the street still from some of the original architecture. But tell me what you think. Well, how is it different now? This, for example, is much more recent renovation on Pike Street, probably in the 2000s. Whereas some of the more original and older architecture still exists, right? But a lot of this is going to be transformed into some unbelievable architecture in the coming years as we approach the St. Road and Campi and Guyana on the other side of the St. Road. Simply because the city is growing, there's a lot of capital, a lot of money flowing into the city, and and there's a lot more interest in this property. People are going to start buying up this property and building. For example, Forbes Burnham Foundation used to be there. That land, piece of plot of land is empty. I'm pretty sure somebody's already eyeing it to build something massive. So that's Pike Street in Kitty, guys. Pike Street in Kitty as you go through the neighborhoods. Plus looking back at Pike Street. If you want to see more content like this, tell me what you click like and subscribe. Tell me what you think about the changes in Georgetown and in Kitty, and more specifically in Pike Street Kitty in 2023. Share with us what you remember about the neighborhood and let people know what's happening here in Georgetown, Guyana. Later!